This isn't going to be your normal gouache video.
Illustrations by Pete.
So there's so many gouache videos on YouTube and how to use gouache and what to do. They all have the same information. It's basically get the consistency right, and this is something that took me a long time to learn. This isn't that kind of information you can get if you spend a weekend with the product. You get it, you use it, you're like, oh, I realize that if I use it this way, it's too thick, and this way is too thin. This is not one of those videos. I'm going to actually explain something that might be useful in this one. And stay tuned until the end, because I went to see a very special person in a very special place with very special stuff. So that should intrigue you to stay till the end, or you'll skip the whole video and just go to the end, and then I just defeated the whole purpose of the intro. Alright, let's break into this. So usually gouache videos don't get a whole lot of views on my channel for some reason. I don't know why, but that's okay. This was all started because Charisse asked a couple of questions, and I wanted to answer those questions in a video a little bit more clearly and show the example of me actually doing the thing that I'm talking about. So there are a few things that are very important with gouache that some people don't seem to mention, but this is how I use it, and I found it so unique and so creative to use them in this way. They spark creativity. So I'm going to explain to you a little bit how I use it, and hopefully that helps you, and you will be encouraged to use it this way when you see, not saying the picture itself looks nice, the piece itself, but just look at the techniques that I'm going to do here and just the textures that develop, and then you can maybe use that in your own work. And maybe it'll inspire you a little bit to do something, because I love gouache. It's one of my favorite mediums to use, and I don't think it gets enough love. I think people look at it differently, but even go way back, go into ancient Egypt, they have gouache basically that they painted with. There's so many uses. It's been around for so long. It's a type of gouache. It's not the exact stuff we have now, but it was basically the same thing. And you go all throughout the centuries, all the old masters used it, and it's just a wonderful thing. And so it actually devolved a little bit as it became more popular. It went into things maybe a little bit less light fastness because they weren't using the proper pigments, because it was just like a quick sketching tool. But then it started to pick up again, and most companies say that their stuff is light fast now, but I don't know. I'm not gonna put the swatches down on a paper and hold it in a window for 6 months like a freak. It's just that nobody does that with their artwork. They don't pin it up in a window for 6 months facing the sun. Nobody does that. So I'm not going to do that with this, but for the most part, they say it's light fast, and it could be. I don't know. You'll have to test that out yourself, or maybe paint something and see if in 100 years it fades, and then you'll know. So the first thing I want to say is quality matters with gouache. Now, some companies, they use these whiteners, and some companies just use larger particles to get the opaqueness. So, like the big box store brands and the cheaper brands, they use whiteners in their formula to make the gouache more opaque. But it doesn't mean that it's better that way. It could be worse. Maybe it's not as light fast because of that, or maybe it looks too chalky because of that. If you look at the gouache in this painting, you'll see it doesn't really look chalky. It looks detailed. But you might not be able to tell if I was using acrylic or if I was using gouache from the final product, aside from actually watching me do this. So the more expensive, or I should say the more reputable, not necessarily expensive, the more reputable companies like M. Graham, they say that they just don't mill down the pigments as fine. So the bigger particles equal more opaqueness is what they say. I don't know if that's how it really works. You'll have to take it up with the M. Graham scientists down there, and they do their thing, and you take it up with them and see if that's the truth. But some brands, like I've used Holbein gouache, and I've used Arteza gouache, and I've used M. Graham gouache, and basically they're all good. They're decent. They work very well. And even, I know the Arteza is more of a student grade. They do list the light fastness on the tubes. I don't know if they're accurate. But It's just your result and how you work with it. But here's a couple more things that are going to help you. So just keep that in mind, that number one thing. Quality matters. You don't want a cheap brand of like Reeves gouache. You're not going to get the same results. I'm not saying it's a terrible company. I'm saying you're not going to get the same results because they use different things in their gouache paint. You want the pigment and the binder, and that's really it. Now here's something that no one that I'm seeing using gouache actually uses it this way. But if you use the watercolor for your darks and then use the gouache for your lights, it's a technique that I learned from, I think it was John Muir Laws, I think is his name. And he has some videos out there. Go look up his videos after you watch this one. Don't cut off my watch time. So, but go look at his stuff, and he does that technique. I think that's where I got it from. I don't remember how long ago this was that I got that, but I do remember that, and I've done several pieces like that. And even when I want to darken up the gouache that I'm using, I don't put a darker shade of gouache on top of the gouache. I actually use watercolor that I put in pure watercolor, heavily concentrated on top of the gouache, and then I blend it out a little bit with the gouache that's underneath and pick up some of the stuff from underneath, and it blends out into a nice color. So that's just another hint. You can get much darker and much more contrast with the watercolor than you can just with a dark gouache. Number 3 is that, I want you to just take this in for a second. So this is one thing that I discovered all by myself. I know that that's true, which means it's probably the worst advice in the bunch. So just take this for whatever it's worth. Here's what happened. I spent a lot more time than I should have going to find colors for my watercolor palette. And then I tried to do the same thing with gouache. It doesn't work. I started with the Holbein gouache, like I said, and I didn't like some of their earth colors. They were not good. Their bright colors are wonderful. Their earth colors were just not the right color to me. Like their umber and it's not the right color to me. They looked disgusting to look at and made me throw up in my mouth a little bit every time I tried to use them. So then I tried the M. Graham gouache, and while they have the basics covered, they're pleasing. They're good colors. They're very transparent though for gouache, so you actually have to use them to build up colors, which I don't mind. If you use gouache very thickly, you do not have to build up the colors, but some people like to build up the colors, so you could thin it out and build up the colors. And M. Graham gouache is great for that. It cracks less in the palette than any other gouache that I've ever used because it does stay a little bit more moist. It will crack. It will. All gouache cracks, but it's less, and it definitely does it. It takes a lot longer for the M. Graham gouache to crack. So a lot of times I would end up adding white to the M. Graham gouache to make it more opaque, and that's sometimes I think it was on one of the people who represent the company who actually mentioned doing that you should add white to the gouache to make it more opaque. But I wanted the color. I didn't want it to be kind of pasteled out by making it lighter. So then I went to Arteza, which is much cheaper, but you can buy so many different. They have 60 different colors of gouache. There's so many colors. The problem is, even if you find a palette that you like, there's certain colors that only come in that 60 set. So when you run out of that one tube, you then have to go buy another set of 60. They don't sell them individually just to get that one tube of paint. And I can't stand that. I don't ever want to do that. So I use the colors that I have from them, and I enjoy their gouache. It's good. I'm not saying anything bad about that company's gouache at all. I just don't want to do that. So now, because I spend so much time picking out the perfect colors for my watercolor, I'm very particular, and that's why I use Daniel Smith, because they have 3 million colors to choose from. So you can definitely find your shade in that brand. And so I find the colors that I want, and then I get a tube of M. Graham gouache, titanium white. A big tube of that, and I always have a pan of that in any palette that I have, and then I just mix my own gouache, because it's not like when you take a gouache color, which is bright, and add white to it and you get this pastel color. When you have a dark color gouache, when you have a dark color watercolor and you add a little bit of gouache to it, you can make it opaque without brightening it too much. And you can just go back and forth and just tint it a little bit darker if you want to with more watercolor. It works out wonderfully well. So that is my tip for you. If you want to carry all of your watercolor palette and have an entire gouache palette with you without carrying another palette, just take your watercolor palette, the colors that you love, and just add a little pan of the M-gram white gouache, the titanium white, or any white gouache. It doesn't have to be theirs. I just like theirs the best because, like I said, it doesn't crack so much, and so it's a lot more easier to manage, and when you flip the palette upside down, the pieces don't fall everywhere. That is obnoxious with gouache. If you ever have a gouache palette and you see it crumble, you go to move around, you put it in your bag or something, you pull it out, all the pieces are all mixed up in all the other colors. That's a pain, so you just use the white M-gram gouache. It stays put in place in the pan, and there's no problem there. So now you have a palette that does both, and that's called killing two birds with, don't you ever kill birds. Don't do that. We don't kill anything here. It's called cuddling two puppies in the same blanket. That's what we're going to call it from now on, and I'm going to have to write to somebody about that. Don't take that from me. That's my phrase. Now that also makes it a little bit more cost effective to paint with gouache because all you're doing is using the same watercolor you have, so you're not having to buy all those other colors again, which could be expensive. If you don't have it, that's expensive. And I'm going to give you a little, this is tip 3.1. It's not another tip, it's just the third point one. So not a lot of people like gouache because it has a reputation for not being light fast, and I discussed that earlier. But the reason is that's why most people look at it as like an illustration tool. You use it, and like even Winsor Newton it's called designer gouache. Most of their gouache was not light fast, maybe up until recently, I don't know. But when I was first looking at the gouache, it was not very light fast. But it wasn't used that way. It was used for a designer to design something, figure something out, or an illustrator, and then they make copies and make prints of that thing, or they send their client their photo and their work, and it's already done. It doesn't have to be light fast. They're not putting it up on a wall. But many companies now, especially M-gram, I know that for a fact, they say that their gouache is light fast. And so now that the companies are starting to use the same pigments that they used for their watercolor in their gouache, you can get the colors you want and have it be light fast and use it that way. I still would highly recommend, even if you're going to get some gouache in colors you want, that you still make sure you use your palette that you're familiar with, that you love with watercolor, that you spent so much time picking out and choosing, and just use that with the white, because it's more pleasing that way. Most of these colors here are that way. Some of them aren't. The bright red and the orange. So on the far left side, you're going to see this orange kind of, I don't know what that is. It's just an orange piece, and then next to that, there's a red one. Those are the actual gouache colors. Those are not me mixing with watercolor, and I do that because there's that orange is my favorite. That's a Holbein watercolor, a Holbein gouache. So that orange is it's called Chinese orange, but it's like a burnt rusty color, and I love that color. Every palette of gouache that I ever have, every palette that I use, I put that color on it if I'm going to use it for gouache, because I have not been able to find that color anywhere else in anything else. So I love that color. That red color there, that's just the naphthol red, and it's usually not as light fast. The naphthol reds are not as light fast as the other reds, but it's just a beautiful bright color. This is going in a sketchbook, so I use it, and I love how bright that red is. I think that was really the only ones that I used. Maybe a little bit of some of the browns might have also been a part of the gouache palette that I used here, but just about everything else was watercolor mixed with gouache. And now going back to the second tip of mixing, using your watercolor for darks and using your gouache for lights, you can also mix them in. So that's what I'm doing here the whole time. I'm laying down gouache, and then sometimes I'm adding white to it to lighten it, to give it a different shade, and sometimes I'm adding just pure watercolor in it to darken it and make it look a little bit darker. And it gives such a nice texture to the painting. I don't think I would do this with anything else. I don't think anything I would use would look as blended and as nice. And it's just something I love about this medium. I love this medium. I love doing, I should do more of this. And I know, I said I was not going to use this book anymore. This is that handbook with the original fluid pulp paper that goes in here. And I wasn't going to use it anymore because the watercolor looks so dull on it. But the gouache, it pops on anything. If you ever have paper that you think, oh, I can't do anything with this, I can't watercolor with it because it falls apart, just use gouache with it. You can put gouache on anything, virtually. It holds its own. Even if you put it on something that has no sizing on it, like a Bristol or something, you can put gouache on it and it still holds up. It still lays on top. So I hope this helped you. I hope this inspired you. I hope you learned something here. And now we're going to go take a trip. So Kristie from Meta Studio is not that far from where I live, and she had a little setup at a craft show, and I went to see her stuff. Her work is amazing. It's beautiful. All the different stuff that she does, from the jewelry to the candle holders to everything that she does is just beautiful. And the cards. I love the cards. As a matter of fact, we picked one up. And my wife may be hooked on doing the dot painting now. She bought the little kit and she's tried it a couple times. We use the Liquitex acrylic ink, and that's what she was using, and she likes it. She enjoys doing it. So thank you very much, Kristie, for that. I'm going to put Kristie's information down below to her shop and everything. You can pick up all that stuff. Thank you so much, Kristie, for showing us everything. I appreciate you so much. So thumb up the video if you've seen all the other gouache videos on YouTube and you think, hey, this is all the same information. I don't understand why one person doesn't make that information and then everybody else can do their experience, just show how to use it instead of giving the exact same information that everybody else gives in every other video. And I hope you did not find that here. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.